Hello, and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine walking through the silent rooms of a Roman villa, your footsteps echoing on wooden floors that should have crumbled to dust 2,000 years ago. You pass a library where papyrus scrolls still rest on their shelves, carbonized but intact. In the kitchen, loaves of bread sit in their ovens, charred black but still bearing the baker's stamp from the morning of August 24th, 79 AD. This is Herculaneum, Pompeii's forgotten neighbour, a city that should be nothing but scattered stones and faded memories. Yet Herculaneum offers us something extraordinary, a more intimate glimpse into Roman life than any other ancient city. While Pompeii was buried under ash, Herculaneum was sealed beneath superheated mud and gas, creating a perfect tomb that preserved the most fragile traces of daily existence. How did this preservation occur? What secrets lie still buried beneath the modern streets above? And why has this remarkable city remained in Pompeii's shadow for so long? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Long before the first Roman sandal pressed into the dark volcanic sand, long before the first marble column rose against the azure sky of the Bay of Naples, there was simply the shore. Picture it, if you can, a gentle promontory reaching out into waters so blue they seemed to hold fragments of heaven itself, where the earth met the sea in the embrace that had been shaping itself for millennia. This was not yet Herculaneum. It was not yet anything that bore a name. It was merely a place where the forces of fire and water had conspired over countless generations to create something extraordinary. The very ground beneath your feet, had you stood there 3,000 years ago, told a story written in stone and ash, in layers of volcanic tuff that spoke of ancient eruptions, of mountains that had exhaled their fury and then settled into long, fertile slumber. The promontory itself was a gift from Vesuvius, though the mountain's generosity came wrapped in violence. Each eruption over the ages had built this landscape, depositing layers of ash and pumice that would, given time and weather, transform into the rich, dark soil that made everything grow with an almost supernatural abundance. The very stones that would one day form the walls of Roman villas were already here, waiting. Tuff, they would call it. This soft, workable volcanic rock that could be quarried easily, carved with simple tools, and yet would harden when exposed to air into something strong enough to bear the weight of centuries. Stand here in your imagination, perhaps 7 centuries before the birth of Christ, and breathe in the salt-sweet air. The Mediterranean stretches endlessly before you, its surface broken only by the distant shapes of islands that float like dreams on the horizon. Behind you, the slopes of Vesuvius rise green and gentle, clothed in forests of oak and chestnut, their leaves whispering secrets in the warm breeze that carries the scent of wild herbs and volcanic earth. This was the world that first called to the Oscans, those Italic peoples who wandered down from the hills and found in this coastline something that spoke to their deepest needs. They were not the first humans to walk these shores. Scattered evidence suggests that even earlier peoples had paused here, drawn by the same abundance that would eventually attract traders and emperors. But the Oscans were the first to truly see the promise of this place, to recognize that here, where mountain met sea, a different kind of life might be possible. They came gradually, as people always do when they are choosing rather than fleeing. Small groups at first, perhaps following the seasonal movements of their flocks, discovering that the coastal grasses stayed green longer, that the fishing was remarkably good, that the soil, when turned with their simple ploughs, yielded crops that grew larger and more abundant than anything they had known in their highland villages. The sea offered its own gifts with generous hands. Fish moved through these waters in great silver schools, tuna and mackerel, sardines that could be caught in nets so heavy it took several men to haul them ashore. Shellfish clung to the rocks where the waves met the land, and in the deeper waters, sponges grew that could be harvested and traded to merchants from distant lands. But perhaps most important of all was the soil itself. This earth, born from ancient fire, possessed qualities that seemed almost magical to these early farmers. Grapes grew here with a sweetness that surprised even those who had tended vines for generations. Olive trees, their silvery leaves catching the morning light, produced fruit so rich and flavourful that traders would travel considerable distances just to sample the oil pressed from their harvest. Grain grew tall and golden, with heads so heavy they bent under their own abundance. The Oscans built their first shelters close to the shore, simple structures of wood and stone that made use of the natural resources at hand. They learned to quarry the tuff, discovering that this soft stone could be cut with bronze tools and would provide excellent foundations for their homes. They learned the rhythms of the sea, the patterns of wind and weather that governed their new lives. Over time, what had begun as seasonal camps became permanent settlements. Children were born here who had never known any other home, who spoke the Oscan language with the particular accent that comes from growing up, where sea breezes carry the sounds of words across the water. These children learned to read the subtle signs that warned of storms approaching, from the west, to distinguish between the calls of different seabirds, to know which winds brought rain and which brought the clear crystalline days when Mount Vesuvius stood sharp and perfect against the morning sky. The mountain itself was both provider and presence. It gave them their fertile soil, their building stone, their abundant harvests. But it also watched over them with a kind of brooding permanence that became part of their understanding of the world. This was not a restless, violent mountain in their experience, it was simply there, as constant as the sea, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. The transformation of this coastal settlement, from a simple Oscan fishing village into something more complex and cosmopolitan, did not happen overnight. Like the slow accumulation of volcanic soil that enriched the land, cultural change came in layers, each new influence settling over the last, creating something richer and more nuanced than what had existed before. The first of these transformative encounters came from the sea itself, carried on ships with painted eyes and curved prows that appeared one morning on the horizon like exotic birds. These were Greek vessels, part of that great flowering of Mediterranean civilization that was spreading its influence across the ancient world through trade, colonization, and the simple human desire to explore what lay beyond the next headland. The Greeks who first made contact with the Oscan settlement were not conquerors in any violent sense. They were traders, adventurers, and colonists who saw in this fertile coastline the same promise that had drawn the original inhabitants. But they brought with them something the Oscans had never encountered, a fully developed urban civilization, complete with its own gods, its own stories, and its own ways of understanding the world. It was the Greeks who first gave this place the name that would echo through history. They saw in the dramatic landscape with its commanding promontory and its proximity to the mysterious mountain a setting worthy of legend. The name they chose, Heracleon, honoured Heracles, that greatest of Greek heroes, whose 12 labours had taken him to the very edges of the known world. Some versions of the story claim that Heracles himself had passed this way during his travels, perhaps stopping to rest on these very shores after completing one of his impossible tasks. Whether the hero had actually visited mattered less than what the name represented. To call a place Heracleon was to declare it significant, to suggest that it possessed qualities of strength and endurance that set it apart from ordinary settlements. The name would evolve over time, flowing through the changes of language and conquest to become, eventually, Herculaneum. But even in its final Latin form, it would carry within it the memory of that first Greek recognition of something special about this place, where mountain met sea. The Greek influence extended far, beyond mere naming. Through their trading networks, they connected this small coastal community to the broader Mediterranean world. Ships began arriving with increasing frequency, their holds filled with goods that had never been seen here before. Fine pottery decorated with scenes from Greek mythology, bronze vessels worked by master craftsmen, wine from distant islands, and most importantly, ideas. The Oscan inhabitants found themselves part of conversations they had never imagined possible. Greek merchants brought news from Syracuse and Massalia, from the Black Sea colonies and the trading posts of Egypt. They spoke of cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, of temples built from marble, of philosophers who spent their days thinking about the nature of existence itself. Gradually, local customs began to incorporate Greek elements. Religious practices evolved as Oscan deities found themselves identified with Greek gods who governed similar domains. But perhaps most significantly, the settlement began to develop a different relationship with the sea. What had once been primarily a source of food became a highway to opportunity. Young men from the community began serving on Greek vessels, learning navigation and seamanship, returning home with tales of distant lands and new ways of living. The settlement's pottery began to reflect Greek artistic influence. Its buildings began to incorporate architectural elements borrowed from Greek colonies, and its inhabitants began to see themselves as part of something larger than their immediate coastal world. This Greek-influenced prosperity and expansion attracted the attention of another people, the Samnites, a confederation of mountain tribes from the interior highlands of central Italy. Unlike the Greeks, who had come primarily as traders and cultural ambassadors, the Samnites arrived as conquerors, though their conquest was more political than destructive. The Samnite domination of the region, which began in the 4th century before Christ, brought yet another layer of cultural influence to what would become Herculaneum. The Samnites were skilled warriors and administrators who understood the value of the coastal settlements they now controlled. Rather than disrupting the growing prosperity of the community, they integrated it into their larger political and economic system. Under Samnite rule, the settlement gained access to the extensive trade networks that connected the mountain communities with the coastal regions, resources that had never been available before, high-quality metals from mountain mines, wool from highland sheep, specialized crafts produced in mountain workshops began flowing through the community's markets. At the same time, the agricultural abundance and maritime resources of the coastal region moved inland, enriching the entire Samnite Confederation. The Samnites also brought their own architectural and urban planning traditions. They were sophisticated builders who understood how to create defensible settlements without sacrificing the comforts of civilian life. Under their influence, the community began to develop the organized street patterns and public spaces that would characterize it throughout its history. Stone construction became more common and more sophisticated, with techniques borrowed from both Greek coastal traditions and Samnite mountain engineering. This period of Samnite dominance created the cultural foundation that would define Herculaneum's character for centuries to come. It was a place that had learned to absorb and integrate influences from multiple sources while maintaining its own distinct identity. The original Oscan connection to the land and sea remained strong, but it was now enriched by Greek sophistication and Samnite organizational skills. The final transformative influence came with the inexorable expansion of Roman power throughout the Italian peninsula. The social war of 91 to 87 years before Christ brought the last independent Italian communities into the Roman system, and in 89 the settlement received the formal status of a Roman municipium. This Roman incorporation represented not an ending but another beginning, the start of the period that would see the small coastal community transform into something unprecedented. A purpose-built paradise for the Roman elite, a place where the accumulated influences of centuries would create an environment of unprecedented luxury and refinement. The transformation of the coastal settlement into a Roman municipium in 89 years before Christ marked the beginning of perhaps the most remarkable metamorphosis in the community's long history. What had been a prosperous but essentially practical place, a community of fishermen, farmers and traders who happened to live in an extraordinarily beautiful location, began to evolve into something entirely different. A deliberate paradise, a place designed not for survival or even prosperity, but for the more subtle and sophisticated goal of human contentment. The Romans who first encountered this stretch of coastline possessed something that earlier civilizations, for all their achievements, had lacked: the accumulated wealth of an entire Mediterranean world and, more importantly, the leisure time that such wealth could purchase. The great Roman families of the late Republic and early Empire were not merely rich in the way that successful merchants or landowners had always been rich. They commanded resources on a scale that allowed them to think beyond the immediate necessities of life, to consider what might constitute the perfect environment for human flourishing. When these Roman aristocrats looked at the Bay of Naples, they saw possibilities that went far beyond commerce or strategic advantage. They saw a stage set that seemed designed by the gods themselves for the pursuit of refined pleasure. The climate here was nearly perfect, with warm summers cooled by sea breezes and mild winters that rarely brought the harsh cold that made life in Rome itself uncomfortable for months at a time. The landscape combined dramatic beauty with practical advantage: steep hillsides that could be terraced into hanging gardens, coastal flats perfect for elaborate villas, and always, everywhere, that extraordinary light that seemed to make colours more vivid and distances more mysterious. But it was not just the natural environment that attracted them. The community they found here had already demonstrated, through its successful absorption of Oscan, Greek, and Samnite influences, a particular genius for creating the kind of harmonious, sophisticated life that Romans of the cultivated classes most admired. This was not a rough frontier settlement that would require decades of civilizing effort. It was already civilized, already cosmopolitan, already possessed of that ineffable quality that Romans called urbanitas, the refined sensibility that could only emerge in a place where different cultures had learned to live together successfully. The Roman development of Herculaneum proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all their great projects, but it was systematic thoroughness applied to the pursuit of beauty rather than conquest. Wealthy families began acquiring land along the coast, not to exploit its agricultural potential, though that remained important, but to create environments that would serve as retreats from the increasingly frantic pace of life in the capital. These were not the massive fortress-like estates that Roman aristocrats built in less favoured locations. The villas that began to rise along the Herculaneum coastline were designed for a different purpose entirely. They were built to take advantage of every natural gift the location offered: the morning light that came across the water, the afternoon breezes that made even the hottest days comfortable, the dramatic views across the bay to the islands that seemed to float like dreams on the horizon. The engineering that went into these developments was as sophisticated as anything the Romans ever accomplished, but it was engineering in service of comfort and beauty rather than military or commercial necessity. Terraces were carved into the hillsides with mathematical precision, creating level platforms where gardens could flourish and buildings could be positioned to capture the best views and the most favourable exposure to light and air. Aqueducts were constructed to bring fresh water not just for drinking and basic needs, but for the elaborate fountain systems and private baths that were considered essential features of civilized life. The architectural style that emerged here was uniquely suited to its environment. Roman builders had learned from Greek traditions but adapted them to local conditions and Roman preferences. Houses were designed to be open to the sea air and the spectacular views, with large windows and spacious terraces that would have been impractical in harsher climates. Interior spaces flowed naturally into exterior ones, creating that seamless integration of human habitation and natural environment that represents perhaps the highest achievement of Mediterranean civilization. But the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was not architectural or even economic. It was social and cultural. Herculaneum was becoming a place where a new kind of life was possible, a life that balanced the Roman virtues of discipline and achievement with the Greek appreciation for beauty and philosophical reflection. The wealthy families who built their retreats here were not abandoning their responsibilities in Rome. They were creating spaces where they could pursue the kind of comprehensive human development that both cultures valued, the cultivation of mind and body in an environment designed to support both. The local community, rather than being displaced by this influx of Roman wealth, found itself elevated and transformed. The skills that had made the settlement successful under previous arrangements, the ability to integrate different cultural influences, the sophisticated understanding of how to live well in a coastal environment, the established networks of trade and communication became even more valuable under the new arrangement. Local families found opportunities not just as servants or labourers for the Roman elite, but as partners in creating the complex social and economic system that luxury leisure required. Craftsmen who had previously created functional pottery for local use found themselves commissioned to produce decorative works that met the aesthetic standards of the most cultivated people in the Mediterranean world. Builders who had constructed solid, practical homes for fishing families learned to work with architects trained in the great urban centres, creating structures that combined Roman engineering with local wisdom about coastal conditions. Farmers who'd grown crops for subsistence and local trade discovered that Roman palates demanded varieties and preparations they had never attempted, opening new possibilities for agricultural innovation and profit. The transformation was gradual enough that it never felt violent or disruptive. This was not conquest in the traditional sense, but something more like a mutual seduction, a recognition by both Roman visitors and local inhabitants that together they could create something neither could achieve alone, a place where human beings could live not just successfully, but beautifully. Let us walk together through the streets of Herculaneum at the height of its prosperity, in those golden decades before the mountain stirred from its ancient sleep. Step with me from your imagined boat onto the small stone quay, where the morning sun casts long shadows across the harbour, and breathe in that distinctive blend of salt air and volcanic earth that greets every visitor to this remarkable place. You find yourself in a town that feels immediately different from the great urban centres you may have known. This is not Rome with its overwhelming scale and constant noise, nor Naples with its crowded markets and endless bustle. Herculaneum possesses something rarer and more precious, the quality of intimacy, of human proportions carefully maintained even as prosperity has allowed for considerable refinement and beauty. The streets before you are narrow but not cramped, paved with blocks of the local tuff that have been cut and fitted with the precision that Roman engineering demanded, but softened by centuries of foot traffic into surfaces that feel almost organic beneath your sandals. These are not the broad ceremonial avenues that characterize imperial cities, but pathways designed for a community where everyone knew their neighbours, where daily life unfolded at a pace that allowed for conversation and contemplation. As you begin to walk inland from the harbour, the gentle slope of the town reveals itself. Herculaneum was built on rising ground, with each street level offering glimpses of the sea through the gaps between buildings, ensuring that no resident was ever completely cut off from the sight and sound of the water that had shaped their community's entire existence. The town planners, whether conscious of it or not, had created an environment where the Mediterranean remained a constant presence, a source of both practical benefit and aesthetic pleasure. The buildings that line these streets tell the story of a community that had learned to balance ambition with restraint. The houses are substantial without being ostentatious, built primarily of the local tuff but dressed with imported materials, marble window frames, bronze fittings, painted stucco, that speak to prosperity without shouting about it. Many rise to second and even third stories, a luxury that was possible here because the volcanic bedrock provided stable foundations and the mild climate made upper floors comfortable year-round. You pause before a typical dwelling and notice how thoughtfully it has been designed for this particular environment. The ground floor opens directly onto the street through a series of wooden shutters that can be folded back during the day to create an almost seamless transition between public and private space. This is where the family's commercial activities take place, perhaps a small shop selling oil pressed from their own olives, or a workshop where leather goods are crafted for both local use and export to markets across the bay. The scents that drift from these street-level spaces create a constantly changing symphony of aromas as you walk. Here, the sharp, clean smell of newly worked metal from a bronze smith's forge. There, the warm, yeasty fragrance of bread baking in an oven heated with olive wood. Further along, the distinctive combination of salt and fish that marks a shop specializing in the various preserved seafoods that were among Herculaneum's most prized exports. You become aware of the sounds that define daily life in this seaside community. The rhythmic hammering of craftsmen at work echoes from courtyards hidden behind the street facades. Children's voices carry from upper floors where families live above their places of business. From the direction of the harbour comes the periodic creak of rope and wood as boats arrive and depart, their captains calling out news from other ports around the bay. The people you encounter on these streets move with the unhurried confidence of those who live in a place where life has found a sustainable rhythm. Merchants opening their shutters for the morning's trade nod familiar greetings to neighbours they have known for years. Women carrying water jars or marketing baskets pause to exchange news and gossip, their conversations conducted in that mixture of languages, Latin, Greek, and local dialects, that reflects the cosmopolitan character of this small but worldly community. As you continue your walk up the gentle slope, the character of the neighbourhood subtly changes. The commercial bustle of the waterfront gives way to more purely residential areas, where the houses become larger and more elaborate, their facades decorated with frescoes that depict scenes from mythology or nature. Gardens become more prominent, their greenery visible through doorways and over garden walls, filled with the flowering plants and fruit trees that thrive in this benevolent climate. You notice how the town's layout takes advantage of every natural gift the location offers. Streets are oriented to capture the sea breezes that make even the hottest summer days pleasant. Buildings are positioned to provide shade during the intense midday hours, while allowing the morning and evening light to flood interior spaces. Terraces and balconies are designed not just as architectural features, but as outdoor living spaces where families gather to enjoy the spectacular views across the bay. The public spaces you encounter speak to a community that values both practical necessity and civic beauty. The Forum, though modest in scale compared to those of great cities, is proportioned with exquisite care, creating a space that feels grand enough to serve its ceremonial functions while remaining intimate enough for the genuine social interaction that was the heart of Roman civic life. The public baths, fed by carefully engineered aqueducts, provide not just hygiene but social gathering spaces where the boundaries between different social classes blur in the democracy of shared comfort. Even the humblest aspects of urban infrastructure reveal the thoughtful attention that characterizes everything about Herculaneum. Drainage systems are designed to handle both the regular winter rains and the occasional torrential downpours that sweep in from the sea. Fresh water flows through a network of pipes and channels that ensure every neighborhood has access to the clean mountain, water that feeds the town's cisterns and fountains. As afternoon begins to fade toward evening, you sense the daily rhythm that has governed life here for generations, a rhythm shaped by the sea, the land, and the mountain that watches over them all. To understand what made Herculaneum truly extraordinary, you must step across the threshold of one of its houses and allow yourself to experience what no other ancient Roman city can offer. The preserved intimacy of domestic life, captured not just in stone and marble, but in the organic materials that normally vanish within decades of abandonment. Here, in these spaces frozen by volcanic catastrophe, wood still bears the marks of the carpenter's tools, and you can trace with your fingertips the grain of beams that supported roofs on the morning when the mountain erupted. Run your hand along the carbonized remains of a wooden doorframe and feel the smooth depression worn by countless hands that reached for the bronze latch now green with age. This is not the abstracted grandeur of ruins stripped down to their marble bones, but something far more personal and immediate, the texture of daily life preserved in materials so fragile they survived only because they were sealed away from air and time by the very disaster that destroyed the people who shaped them. The houses of Herculaneum reveal themselves as complex vertical worlds that rose to heights rarely preserved in other ancient cities. Climb the wooden stairs, still solid beneath your feet after nearly 2 millennia, to the upper floors that in most Roman sites exist only in the archaeologist's imagination. Here you can stand in second-story rooms where families slept and worked, where children played on wooden floors that creak faintly under your weight, where mothers called down to their daughters through openings that connected the levels of these intimate domestic worlds. The architecture speaks of a society that had learned to make the most of limited space without sacrificing comfort or beauty. Ground floors served multiple functions, combining commercial activities with family life in ways that created natural gathering places and social centres. Workshops opened directly onto the street, allowing craftsmen to work in the natural light while remaining part of the community's daily conversation. Behind these public spaces, courtyards provided private family areas where children could play safely and women could work at their household tasks while remaining connected to the social life of the neighbourhood. The wooden elements that survived tell stories that stone cannot convey. Examine the carbonized remains of a bed frame, and you can see how the joinery was accomplished, how the craftsman chose to shape the legs for both strength and elegance. The wood itself speaks of trade networks that reached far beyond the local region. Some of these timbers show the characteristics of trees that grew in the mountains of central Italy, carefully selected and transported to Herculaneum by builders who understood that the moist sea air demanded wood that could resist decay and warping. Furniture, preserved in forms that elsewhere exist only in artistic representations, reveals the sophisticated comfort that characterized domestic life in this prosperous community. Tables still bear the marks of daily use, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of meals and conversations. Cupboards retain the exact dimensions their makers calculated for storing the specific needs of Roman households, spaces sized for amphora and storage jars, shelves designed to hold the particular implements of daily life. The preservation extends to details so minute they seem almost miraculous. Wooden hinges still show the precise angles at which doors swung open and closed. Window shutters retain the carved patterns that controlled light and airflow, revealing how residents managed the intense Mediterranean sun while maximizing the benefits of sea breezes. Even rope, that most perishable of materials, survives in carbonized form, still showing the twist and weave that connected the various parts of these complex domestic machines. Move through these multi-level houses and you begin to understand how Roman families actually lived in ways that no literary source fully captures. The flow between rooms reveals patterns of daily activity. Kitchens positioned to minimize smoke and cooking odors, bedrooms located to catch morning light, work areas placed where natural illumination made detailed tasks possible. Storage spaces show how households managed their resources, with areas specifically designed for different types of goods: dry storage for grain and preserved foods, cool spaces for wine and oil, secure areas for valuable items. The vertical organization of these houses created opportunities for privacy and social interaction that would have been impossible in single-story structures. Upper floors served as retreats, where family members could withdraw from the public activities of ground-level life, while maintaining visual and auditory connection through internal courtyards and staircases. Balconies and terraces provided outdoor living spaces that took advantage of views and breezes, while offering protection from the intense midday sun. But perhaps most remarkable of all are the traces of the craftsmen who built these structures. Tool marks in wooden beams show the rhythm of ancient work, the steady strokes of adzes and planes that shaped timbers into the exact dimensions required. Carpenters' marks, scratched into wood to guide assembly, remain visible on joints and connections, revealing construction techniques that combined Roman engineering principles with local knowledge of how to build for coastal conditions. The integration of different materials demonstrates the sophisticated understanding these builders possessed of their environment. Stone foundations provided stability and moisture protection, while wooden superstructures offered flexibility and comfort. Tile roofs, many still perfectly intact, show how water was managed and directed to cisterns and drainage systems. Bronze fittings and iron reinforcements, their patina and corrosion patterns telling their own stories, reveal how metal and wood were combined to create structures that could withstand both daily use and the occasional severity of Mediterranean storms. Standing in these preserved spaces, surrounded by the carbonized remnants of ordinary life, you experience something that no other archaeological site can provide: the immediate presence of human habitation, the sense that the people who lived here have only momentarily stepped away, leaving behind not just the grand gestures of their civilization, but the intimate details of how they arrange their daily existence within spaces designed for human flourishing. In the heart of every Herculaneum home, you would find what archaeologists now recognize as one of the most intimate and revealing spaces of ancient domestic life: the kitchen, with its ovens still containing the carbonized remains of the last meals prepared before the mountain's fury transformed daily bread into eternal testament. Here, preserved in forms so perfect they seem to mock the passage of time, are loaves that emerged from their ovens on the morning of August 24th, 79 years after Christ, their crusts still bearing the distinctive patterns that identified the baker who shaped them. Hold one of these carbonized loaves in your imagination, and feel its surprising weight, its familiar proportions. This is not the airy, uniform product of industrial baking, but bread with the irregular contours that speak of human hands at work. The surface bears the deep score marks that allowed steam to escape during baking, and if you look closely you can still make out the baker's stamp pressed into the dough before it went into the oven, a mark of pride and identification that connected this humble loaf to the craftsman who created it, and the family who would consume it. The ovens themselves tell their own stories of daily routine and community cooperation. These were substantial structures built into the walls of houses, their domed chambers constructed from local tuff, and lined with fire-resistant clay that could withstand the intense heat required for proper bread making. The oven mouth, carefully sized to retain heat while allowing access, shows the wear patterns of decades of use: smooth depressions where bread peels slid in and out, carbon stains from countless firings, the accumulated patina of a lifetime spent in service to human hunger. Understanding how these ovens worked reveals the rhythm that governed domestic life in ways that no written source fully captures. Bread making was not a simple daily task, but a complex process that required planning, cooperation, and considerable skill. The ovens had to be heated with wood fires that burned intensely, for hours, heating the stone and clay to temperatures that would sustain baking long after the flames died away. This meant that bread was not made fresh each morning, but rather produced in batches that would sustain families for several days. Watch in your mind's eye as the morning bread making unfolds. The fire is kindled before dawn, carefully fed with olive wood that burns hot and clean, producing the intense heat required to thoroughly warm the oven's thermal mass. As the sun rises over the bay, the flames are allowed to die down, and the ashes are carefully swept from the oven floor, leaving behind a chamber so hot that flour thrown onto its surface would burst into flame. This is the moment when the baker's true skill becomes apparent. Into this scorching environment go the loaves, shaped the night before and left to rise slowly in the cool night air. The baker must judge the heat precisely. Too hot, and the outside will char before the inside bakes through. Too cool, and the bread will emerge heavy and dense. The sound of the crust forming, the subtle changes in aroma that indicate proper development, the visual cues that tell the experienced baker when each loaf has reached perfection, all of these require knowledge passed down through generations of daily practice. But bread was only one element in the complex symphony of food preparation that defined domestic life. The kitchens of Herculaneum were equipped with cooking facilities that reveal a cuisine of considerable sophistication and variety. Bronze vessels, their surfaces still showing the marks of use, tell of stews and sauces that simmered slowly over carefully controlled fires. Storage jars, their contents long vanished, but their forms, speaking to the preservation techniques that allowed families to maintain varied diets throughout the year, line the walls in orderly profusion. The amphora that crowd the storage areas speak of trade networks that brought exotic flavours to even modest tables. Oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, preserved fish from the Atlantic coasts, honey from mountain regions where bees fed on wild herbs, all of these found their way to Herculaneum kitchens, where they were incorporated into daily meals that combined local abundance with imported luxury. The sea provided its own constant bounty, and the cooking facilities reveal how this marine harvest was prepared and preserved. Specialized vessels for fish cookery, their shapes optimized for particular preparation methods, show how families made the most of the daily catch. Smoking chambers, salt storage areas, and the equipment for preparing the various fish sauces that were essential to Roman cuisine all speak to a community that had learned to extract maximum nutrition and flavor from the ocean's gifts. The volcanic soil contributed its own abundance to family tables. Storage areas contain the carbonized remains of grain, legumes, nuts, and dried fruits that speak to agricultural techniques perfected over centuries of cultivation. The variety is remarkable, not just the basic grains that sustained life, but specialty crops that added flavor, nutrition, and pleasure to daily meals. Herbs and spices, their aromatic oils long vanished but their seeds still identifiable, reveal seasoning practices that transformed simple ingredients into memorable meals. Perhaps most touching of all are the preserved cooking implements themselves, ladles worn smooth by countless hands, cutting boards marked by generations of knife work, measuring vessels calibrated to family-specific recipes. These tools speak to the intimate knowledge that connected cooks to their craft, the accumulated wisdom of mothers teaching daughters, the subtle adjustments and personal touches that made each family's food distinctive. The daily rhythm of food preparation created natural gathering times that brought families together around shared tasks and common needs. Morning bread making became a social occasion when neighbours might share ovens and exchange news. Meal preparation times provided opportunities for teaching and learning, for passing down not just recipes but the deeper cultural knowledge that food carries from generation to generation. In these preserved kitchens, you glimpse something precious and universal, the fundamental human activity of transforming raw materials into nourishment, comfort, and social connection. Beyond the modest comfort of the town's residential quarters, in the most favoured locations where the coastline curved gracefully toward the sea, stood the villas that revealed Herculaneum's true character as a refuge for those who had achieved not merely wealth, but the leisure to pursue the highest expressions of human culture. Here, where the morning light came across the water in long golden shafts and the afternoon breezes carried the scent of flowering gardens, the Roman elite created environments that represented perhaps the most sophisticated attempt in human history to design spaces specifically for the cultivation of mind and spirit. The Villa of the Papyri, that extraordinary complex that stretched along the ancient coastline like a temple, dedicated to learning itself, stands as the supreme example of what Roman civilization could achieve when unlimited resources were directed toward intellectual rather than military ends. Imagine approaching this villa from the sea, as many of its most distinguished visitors would have done, arriving by private vessel to a landing designed specifically to create the proper sense of anticipation and wonder. You step from your boat onto a marble quay, where bronze statues of Greek philosophers and poets seem to welcome you into a world removed from the ordinary concerns of commerce and politics. The villa rises before you in a series of terraced levels, each carefully positioned to take advantage of the views, while creating intimate spaces for different aspects of cultured life. Gardens flow seamlessly into covered walkways, and covered walkways open onto libraries and reading rooms where the accumulated wisdom of centuries waits in carefully organized silence. The scale of this villa challenges every assumption about ancient domestic architecture. This is not merely a large house, but a complex designed to accommodate the varied needs of intellectual life on the grandest possible scale. Separate wings provide space for different activities: quiet study, social conversation, artistic creation, physical exercise, and contemplative solitude. Guest quarters ensure that scholars and artists from across the Mediterranean world can stay for extended periods, contributing to ongoing conversations about philosophy, literature, and the arts. Move through the villa's famous library, that miracle of preservation that has given us our only substantial surviving collection of ancient philosophical texts, and sense the reverent atmosphere that must have pervaded these spaces. The papyrus scrolls, carbonized but still readable after nearly 2 millennia, line the walls in wooden cases designed specifically for their storage and protection. Here are works by Epicurus and his followers, treatises on ethics and natural philosophy that represent the highest achievements of Greek thought, preserved by Roman patrons who understood their value and were willing to invest enormous resources in maintaining access to this intellectual heritage. The reading rooms attached to the library reveal how serious scholarship was conducted in this rarefied environment. Reading stands positioned to catch the best light, comfortable seating that allowed for hours of study, writing materials of the finest quality, everything arranged to remove the physical obstacles that might interfere with pure intellectual engagement. The very air in these spaces seems to carry the weight of centuries of serious thought, the accumulated presence of minds grappling with the fundamental questions of human existence. The villa's art collection, distributed throughout its rooms and gardens in arrangements that created ongoing dialogues between different pieces and different traditions, represents perhaps the finest assemblage of Greek and Roman sculpture ever gathered in a single private residence. Bronze portraits of Greek philosophers stand in contemplative conversation with marble representations of Roman statesmen. Mythological scenes carved in relief create narrative sequences that unfold as you move through the villa's carefully planned spaces. But the most remarkable aspect of this extraordinary environment is how it integrated aesthetic pleasure with intellectual serious purpose. The frescoes that decorate the walls do not merely provide visual delight. They depict scenes from literature and philosophy that would have served as starting points for the conversations that filled these rooms with the sound of cultured voices exploring ideas that had occupied human beings for centuries. The gardens that surround the villa create outdoor spaces for contemplation and discussion that rival the beauty of the interior rooms. Carefully planned landscapes incorporate both formal geometric patterns that please the eye with their order, and more naturalistic areas that provide the kind of varied, changing environment that stimulates thought and creativity. Fountains and pools create the gentle sound of moving water that masks distracting noise while providing the kind of consistent, soothing background that aids concentration. The villa's dining areas reveal how even the most practical aspects of daily life were elevated to serve intellectual and aesthetic purposes. Elaborate mosaics on the floors and walls create environments where meals became occasions for sophisticated conversation. The famous symposium tradition, where food and wine provided the setting for philosophical discussion, found its perfect expression in rooms designed specifically to encourage the kind of relaxed but serious conversation that represents human social life at its most refined. The sleeping quarters, with their views across the bay and their careful attention to comfort without luxury, suggest inhabitants who valued rest and solitude as necessary components of the intellectual life. These are not the ostentatious bedrooms of people seeking to display wealth, but the private retreats of individuals who understood that serious thinking requires both stimulation and withdrawal, both social engagement and personal reflection. Standing in these preserved spaces, Surrounded by the carbonized remains of scrolls that contain some of the most important philosophical thinking of the ancient world, you experience something unique in human history, a complete environment designed by people who had solved the fundamental problems of survival and security and were free to devote their resources to the question of what human life might become when material constraints are removed and intellectual possibility becomes the primary concern. The prosperity and cultural sophistication that defined Herculaneum at its zenith did not exist in isolation, but rather formed part of an intricate web of connections that stretched across the Mediterranean world and into the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire. To understand how this small coastal community sustained its remarkable way of life, you must follow the threads that connected its quiet streets to the great trade routes, the political centres, and the distant provinces that supplied both the necessities and luxuries that made such refined living possible. Stand in the early morning at Herculaneum's modest harbour and watch the boats arrive with the dawn breeze filling their sails. These are not the great merchant vessels that serve the major ports of the empire, but smaller craft designed for the coastal trade that connected communities around the Bay of Naples and beyond. Their captains know every inlet and anchorage along hundreds of miles of coastline, and their holds contain the diverse goods that sustained both the daily needs and elevated pleasures of Herculaneum's residents. From the volcanic islands that dot the bay come pumice and specialized volcanic products prized for construction and crafts. From the fertile coastal plains arrive the surplus agricultural products that allowed Herculaneum to support a population engaged in activities other than basic food production. Wine from the renowned vineyards that covered the slopes of Vesuvius itself moves through the harbour, alongside oil pressed from olives grown in groves that had been cultivated for centuries. But the most significant trade connections reached far beyond the immediate region. Herculaneum served as a distribution point for goods moving between the great commercial centres of the Mediterranean and the wealthy villas that line the entire Bay of Naples coastline. Merchants who maintained permanent residences in the community served as intermediaries in trade networks that connected Spain with Syria, Britain with Egypt, and brought to local markets products that represented the economic integration of the entire known world. The merchant families of Herculaneum occupied a distinctive position in the social hierarchy of their community. They were not the great landowners who owned the spectacular villas, nor were they the simple craftsmen and fishermen who provided basic services. Instead, they formed a middle class whose prosperity depended on their ability to understand and anticipate the desires of the wealthy, while maintaining the connections and credit networks that made complex commerce possible across vast distances. These merchants lived in substantial houses that reflected their prosperity, without competing with the villas of their most important customers. Their homes served multiple functions, combining family residences with commercial facilities, storage areas for valuable goods, offices where accounts were maintained and correspondence conducted, reception rooms where business relationships were nurtured through the personal connections that made long-distance trade possible in an era before modern banking and communication systems. The goods that moved through Herculaneum's commercial networks tell the story of an empire that had achieved unprecedented economic integration. From Gaul came fine pottery and metalwork, products of workshops that had learned to combine Celtic artistic traditions with Roman technical standards. Spanish silver, worked into jewellery and decorative objects, arrived alongside preserved fish and the renowned fish sauces that had become essential elements of Roman cuisine throughout the empire. From the eastern provinces came the luxury goods that wealthy Romans demanded: silk from routes that ultimately reached China, spices from India that could transform the simplest meal into an exotic experience, precious stones and pearls that satisfied the Roman appetite for personal display. These expensive items moved in small quantities through carefully guarded networks that depended on personal relationships and mutual trust built up over years of successful transactions. The local workshops of Herculaneum both served these trade networks and depended on them. Craftsmen who worked in bronze and silver required raw materials that came from mines scattered across the empire, but their finished products found markets far beyond their immediate community. The distinctive artistic styles that developed in Herculaneum workshops, combining Greek aesthetic traditions with Roman practical demands and local technical innovations, created products that were sought after in distant markets. The social connections that made this commerce possible extended far beyond simple business relationships. Wealthy families maintained houses in multiple locations, creating personal networks that facilitated trade and cultural exchange. A Roman aristocrat might own estates in different provinces, a villa in Herculaneum, and a house in Rome itself, creating opportunities for trusted servants, business agents, and social connections to move goods and information across the empire. The slaves and freedmen who managed much of the day-to-day commercial activity in Herculaneum often possessed skills and knowledge that made them valuable in ways that transcended their legal status. Many had been educated in the eastern provinces and brought linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge that proved essential for maintaining trade relationships across cultural boundaries. Their manumission often led to continued business relationships with their former owners, creating networks of obligation and opportunity that could span generations. The integration of Herculaneum into these broader networks brought not just material prosperity, but cultural enrichment that shaped every aspect of local life. Ideas, artistic styles, religious practices, and intellectual traditions moved along the same routes that carried commercial goods. A philosopher from Athens might arrive in the same ship that brought marble from Greek quarries, and his presence in local intellectual circles could influence thought and conversation for years after his departure. This economic and cultural integration created a remarkably stable foundation for the sophisticated lifestyle that characterized Herculaneum at its peak. But it also created dependencies that would prove fragile when disrupted by forces beyond human control. Beyond the grand architecture and impressive trade networks, beyond even the carefully preserved kitchens with their carbonized bread, lie the most intimate traces of human presence. The fragments of daily life so personal and immediate that they seem to collapse the centuries between us and the people who once called Herculaneum home. These are the details that transform archaeological sites from museums of ancient achievement into spaces where you can almost hear the whispered conversations of families gathered around evening lamps, the soft rustle of fabric as someone adjusts a garment, the gentle creak of wooden hinges as doors open to admit the morning light. Touch the carbonized remains of a wooden door and feel beneath your fingers the smooth depression worn by countless hands reaching for the bronze handle. This is not the abstract presence of vanished civilizations, but something as immediate and personal as the wear patterns on the doorknobs of your own home. The wood itself tells stories that no written chronicle could capture. The particular grain pattern that the original carpenter chose for both strength and beauty. The slight warping that speaks of decades of Mediterranean humidity. The careful mortise and tenon joints that held firm until the moment when volcanic heat transformed everything into carbonized preservation. Step across these ancient thresholds, and you enter spaces where the textures of intimate life remain visible in ways that seem almost miraculous. Here, folded against the wall of a modest bedroom, are the carbonized remains of fabric that still shows the weave pattern of the original cloth. Run your fingers along these fragile remnants and sense the weight and texture of material that once provided warmth and comfort to people whose names we will never know, but whose need for beauty and softness we immediately recognize. The preservation of textiles at Herculaneum provides glimpses into aspects of daily life that rarely survive from antiquity. These are not the elaborate ceremonial garments that appear in artistic representations, but the everyday clothing that reveals how ordinary people dressed themselves each morning, how they chose colours and fabrics that pleased them, how they repaired and maintained the textiles that represented significant investments in household resources. Examine the remains of a simple tunic, its carbonized fibres still showing the careful hemming that speaks of skilled needlework, the reinforced areas that indicate points of regular stress, the faded traces of dye that once provided colour and personal expression. This garment was worn by someone who moved through the same streets you have been exploring, who felt the same sea breezes and morning light, who chose this particular shade of blue or brown because it pleased their eye or matched other items in their limited wardrobe. The wooden furniture that survived the disaster creates an almost uncanny sense of presence, as if the people who used these objects have only momentarily stepped away. Sit for a moment on the edge of a carbonized bed frame, its dimensions calculated for human comfort nearly 2,000 years ago, and feel the connection across time to people who experience the same basic human needs for rest and comfort that define your own daily routine. The bed itself tells multiple stories: the craftsmanship that shaped the wood, the social status indicated by the quality of construction the family relationship suggested by its size and placement within the house. But perhaps most moving of all are the subtle signs of use, the slight depression in the frame where someone regularly sat to put on sandals, the wear pattern on the posts where hands gripped during illness or childbirth, the careful repairs that speak of families who valued their possessions and maintained them across generations. Move through these preserved interiors and notice how personal objects create an atmosphere of interrupted intimacy. A bronze mirror still reflects light, its surface polished by hands that checked their appearance each morning before venturing into the social world of the streets. Cosmetic containers hold the remnants of preparations used to enhance beauty or protect skin from the Mediterranean sun. Hairpins scattered on a dressing table suggest the daily ritual of arranging hair, the private moments of self-care that preceded public appearances. The children's toys that survived provide perhaps the most poignant connection to the human reality of these vanished lives. A wooden doll, its features still visible despite carbonization, was once held and cherished by a child whose laughter filled these rooms. Gaming pieces speak to evening entertainment, to families gathered around tables sharing the simple pleasures that make domestic life meaningful across all cultures and centuries. Even the tools of daily work carry this intimate quality. A carpenter's plane still shows the wear patterns of skilled hands, the particular angle at which it was held, the rhythm of work that shaped wood into useful and beautiful objects. A seamstress's needles, their bronze still bright after centuries, speak to the careful handwork that created and maintained the textiles that made life comfortable and attractive. The acoustic qualities of these preserved spaces add another dimension to their intimacy. Stand quietly in a carbonized room, and you become aware of how sound would have travelled through these spaces. Conversations carrying between floors through wooden staircases, footsteps echoing on tough floors, the gentle sounds of domestic activity creating the constant, comfortable background noise of family life. Perhaps most remarkable of all are the spaces where multiple layers of personal history remain visible. Here, repairs to wooden beams show how families adapted their homes to changing needs over decades of occupation. There, where patterns on stone thresholds reveal the paths most frequently travelled by the people who called these spaces home. Everywhere, the accumulation of small choices and daily routines creates a texture of human presence that makes these ancient spaces feel not like ruins, but like homes temporarily emptied, waiting for their inhabitants to return. Even in paradise, the earth beneath your feet remembers its violent origins, and for those who lived in Herculaneum during the decades before its final transformation, there were subtle but persistent reminders that their beautiful coastal refuge existed at the sufferance of forces far more powerful than human civilization. The prosperity and refinement that defined their community had been built, quite literally, upon the accumulated violence of millennia, and occasionally the mountain that had given them their fertile soil and perfect building stone would stir in its sleep, sending tremors through the carefully constructed world they had created. The earthquake that struck in the year 62 after Christ arrived without warning on an ordinary winter morning when the streets were filled with people going about their daily routines. The initial shock lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but those seconds revealed the fundamental fragility that lay beneath all their achievements. Buildings that had stood for generations suddenly developed cracks that ran like lightning bolts through walls of solid stone. Roofs that had sheltered families for decades shifted on their supports, creating gaps where rain would penetrate and weaken the wooden structures that held everything together. In those 30 seconds, the accumulated confidence of centuries was shaken as thoroughly as the buildings themselves. People who had never questioned the solidity of their world found themselves standing in doorways as their homes swayed around them, watching in amazement and terror as the very ground beneath their feet moved like the deck of a ship in heavy seas. The earthquake was not the catastrophic event that would eventually destroy their world, but it served as an unwelcome reminder that their existence depended on the continued stability of geological forces that acknowledged no human authority. The immediate aftermath of the quake revealed both the resilience and the underlying vulnerabilities of Herculaneum society. Families emerged from their shaken houses to discover that their neighbours had experienced the same terrifying moments of helplessness. The social bonds that held the community together proved stronger than the stone and mortar that had been damaged, and within hours the work of assessment and repair had begun. But the damage was extensive enough to require resources that stretched even this prosperous community's capacity for recovery. Walk through the streets in the months following the earthquake, and you would have encountered a town in the process of rebuilding itself, but rebuilding under circumstances that revealed the economic and social stresses that prosperity had previously masked. The wealthy villa owners possessed the resources to repair their properties quickly and completely, often using the opportunity to make improvements and additions that enhanced their comfort and prestige. But for families of more modest means, the choice between immediate repair and careful economy created difficult decisions that would influence their lives for years to come. Many chose to make temporary repairs that would protect their property from weather and provide basic functionality, postponing more extensive restoration until resources permitted proper attention to structural issues. This practical response created a patchwork of recovery across the community, where some buildings returned to their former glory, while others bore the visible scars of hasty repair work that was always intended to be replaced by something better when circumstances allowed. The earthquake also revealed the extent to which Herculaneum's built environment depended on specialized knowledge and skills that were not always easily available when suddenly needed by the entire community simultaneously. The master builders who understood the properties of tough construction, the craftsmen who could repair complex wooden joinery, the artists who could restore damaged frescoes, all found themselves overwhelmed by demand for their services. Prices rose, schedules stretched, and families found themselves living in partially repaired houses while waiting for skilled attention to the details that would complete their recovery. Perhaps most significantly, the earthquake forced the community to confront the reality that their beautiful coastal location came with inherent risks that could not be eliminated by wealth, engineering skill, or social organization. Mount Vesuvius, which had provided the volcanic soil that made their agriculture so productive, and the tough stone that made their architecture so distinctive, was not simply a picturesque backdrop to their refined existence, but an active geological system whose behavior could not be predicted or controlled. The years that followed the earthquake of '62 brought a gradual recognition that complete recovery might not be possible within the timescale that had originally been anticipated. Some damaged buildings remained partially repaired because the cost of complete restoration exceeded what families could afford without compromising other aspects of their lives. Public buildings received priority attention, but even these projects proceeded more slowly than had been hoped, creating a persistent visual reminder of the community's vulnerability. The psychological impact of living with this ongoing evidence of natural forces proved as significant as the physical damage itself. Conversations that had once focused exclusively on trade, culture, and social relationships now included regular discussions of tremors, building stability, and the wisdom of various approaches to earthquake-resistant construction. The earthquake had not destroyed Herculaneum, but it had introduced an element of uncertainty into daily life that had not existed before. Even as life returned to its accustomed rhythms and many of the visible signs of damage disappeared under skilled repair work, the deeper lesson remained. Human civilization, however sophisticated and prosperous, existed within natural systems that operated according to their own imperatives. The mountain that had blessed Herculaneum with fertility and beauty remained an unpredictable neighbour, whose next stirring might prove far more destructive than a mere earthquake. The prosperity that defined Herculaneum at its zenith created a society of remarkable sophistication and cultural achievement, but it also generated social tensions that remained largely hidden beneath the polished surfaces of daily life. Walk through the town's streets with an eye not just for architectural beauty, but for the subtle indicators of economic status, and you begin to perceive the complex hierarchy that shaped relationships between neighbours who lived within sight of each other but inhabited fundamentally different worlds. The magnificent villas that crowned the most desirable locations along the coastline represented not simply individual wealth, but concentrations of resources so vast that they dwarfed the combined assets of entire neighbourhoods of ordinary residents. The villa of the Pompeii alone, with its extensive grounds, elaborate architecture, and priceless collections, represented an investment that exceeded the total value of dozens of the modest houses where craftsmen, merchants, and fishermen lived with their families. This was not merely a difference of degree, but a difference of kind, creating social distances that could not be bridged by personal charm or individual achievement. Consider the daily routine of a wealthy villa owner and compare it to the life of a family living in one of the town's smaller houses. The villa owner wakes in rooms designed specifically for comfort and beauty, attended by slaves whose only responsibility is ensuring his personal needs are met immediately and completely. His day unfolds according to his own preferences and interests, perhaps reading in his private library, discussing philosophy with equally cultivated friends, or supervising improvements to his already magnificent property. His meals are prepared by skilled cooks using the finest ingredients available anywhere in the Mediterranean world, served on vessels crafted by master artisans, accompanied by wines selected from the best vintages of multiple provinces. Meanwhile, the craftsman who lives a few streets away begins his day before dawn, lighting his forge or opening his workshop to take advantage of the morning light for detailed work. His meals consist of simple but nourishing food prepared by family members whose time is divided between household duties and economic activities that contribute to the family's survival. His children help with work from an early age, learning skills that will determine their future prospects, and his wife manages resources carefully, because even small miscalculations can create genuine hardship. The social protocols that governed interaction between these different classes created elaborate systems of deference and obligation that reinforced existing hierarchies while maintaining the appearance of harmonious community life. When the villa owner walked through the town's commercial districts, merchants and craftsmen offered respectful greetings that acknowledged his superior status while hoping for the patronage that could transform their own economic prospects. These encounters, however brief and ceremonial, served as daily reminders of the vast differences in power and resources that shaped every aspect of community life. The physical environment itself reinforced these distinctions in ways both obvious and subtle. The villa owners commanded the most beautiful locations, with unobstructed views of the sea and carefully designed gardens that created private worlds of extraordinary beauty. Their houses were oriented to capture the best light and air, positioned to minimize noise and maximize privacy, constructed with the finest materials and most skilled craftsmanship available. The working families of Herculaneum, in contrast, lived in houses that, while comfortable by ancient standards, were constrained by practical considerations of cost and space. Their windows looked out on neighbouring buildings rather than scenic vistas. Their rooms served multiple functions rather than being dedicated to single purposes, and their furnishings, while well made, were chosen for durability and utility rather than aesthetic perfection. The economic relationships that connected these different social levels created dependencies that could prove fragile during periods of stress or change. The villa owners relied on local craftsmen, merchants, and service providers to maintain their comfortable lives, but their patronage was voluntary and could be withdrawn without warning if economic conditions changed or personal preferences shifted. The working families conversely depended on this patronage for much of their income, making them vulnerable to decisions made by people who might not fully understand or appreciate the consequences of their choices for others. Perhaps most significantly, the very prosperity that made Herculaneum attractive to the wealthy elite created economic pressures that made life more difficult for ordinary residents. The presence of so much concentrated wealth drove up prices for everything from housing to basic foodstuffs, as suppliers naturally oriented their efforts toward customers who could pay premium prices. Land values rose to levels that made property ownership increasingly difficult for families of modest means, creating a growing class of people who worked in the town but could never hope to own their own homes. The cultural sophistication that the wealthy brought to Herculaneum, the art, literature, and intellectual discourse that made the community famous throughout the Roman world, remained largely inaccessible to the families whose labour made such refinement possible. While the villa owners debated philosophical questions in their libraries, their neighbours struggled with more immediate concerns about earning enough to support their families and maintain their position in an increasingly competitive economic environment. These social tensions rarely erupted into open conflict, but they created an underlying fragility that made the entire community vulnerable to disruptions that might affect the economic relationships binding different classes together. Mount Vesuvius had always been there, as much a part of the landscape as the sea itself, its slopes rising green and gentle beyond the town's carefully tended gardens, its peak a familiar landmark that helped sailors navigate the coastal waters and provided residents with a constant point of reference in their daily lives. To the people of Herculaneum, the mountain was not a threat to be feared, but a benevolent presence that had shaped their world in ways so fundamental that they rarely paused to consider the relationship between their prosperity and the geological forces that had created the very ground beneath their feet. The fertile soil that made their agriculture so remarkably productive was Vesuvius's gift, deposited over millennia by eruptions that had occurred long before human memory began recording the history of this coastline. Each layer of volcanic ash and pumice had contributed to the rich earth that now supported vineyards, olive groves, and grain fields of extraordinary abundance. The very prosperity that defined Herculaneum's character, the surplus wealth that allowed for leisure, culture, and architectural refinement, ultimately traced its origins to ancient volcanic processes that had transformed barren rock into some of the most fertile agricultural land in the Mediterranean world. The building stones that formed the foundations and walls of every structure in the town told the same story of volcanic origin. The tuff that local quarries provided in such abundance was itself the product of earlier eruptions, compressed and hardened over geological time into a material that combined workability with durability. When masons shaped these blocks with their tools, they were working with stone that had once been superheated gas and ash, transformed by pressure and time into the solid foundation of human habitation. Yet this intimate relationship between human prosperity and volcanic activity remained largely invisible to the people who benefited from it. The mountain's last major eruption lay so far in the past that no living person retained even ancestral memories of volcanic activity. To the residents of Herculaneum, Vesuvius was simply part of the natural order, as permanent and unchanging as the coastline itself. Its slopes provided grazing for sheep and goats, its forests supplied timber and fuel, its presence created the distinctive microclimate that made their coastal location so pleasant for human habitation. The gradual nature of soil formation and the imperceptible processes of geological change meant that the connection between mountain and prosperity remained hidden beneath the apparent stability of daily life. When farmers praised their rich harvests, they attributed their success to favourable weather, careful cultivation, and perhaps the blessing of agricultural deities. When builders admired the quality of their construction stone, they focused on the skill of quarrymen and masons rather than the volcanic processes that had created the material itself. The mountain was simply there, a backdrop to human activity rather than an active participant in the processes that shaped their world. This comfortable familiarity with Vesuvius reflected a broader human tendency to normalize even the most extraordinary environmental conditions when they remained stable for extended periods. The residents of Herculaneum lived their entire lives in a volcanic landscape, but because that landscape appeared permanent and unchanging, they experienced it as simply normal. Children grew up with the mountain as a constant presence in their visual field, learning to read weather patterns by the clouds that formed around its peak, using its distinctive profile to orient themselves when travelling by land or sea. The wine that graced their tables, pressed from grapes that grew with exceptional sweetness on the volcanic slopes, carried within its flavour the chemical signature of the mountain's ancient activity. But this geological heritage expressed itself as simply superior quality rather than any reminder of the forces that had created the terroir. The distinctive character of Vesuvian wine was a source of pride and economic advantage, not a subtle warning about the nature of the landscape that produced it. Even the mild earthquakes that occasionally shook the region were understood as isolated events rather than symptoms of ongoing geological processes. The Romans had developed sophisticated engineering techniques for earthquake-resistant construction, and their philosophical traditions included thoughtful consideration of natural disasters as aspects of the world that must be accepted with wisdom and fortitude. But these practical and intellectual responses treated seismic activity as separate phenomena rather than manifestations of the same volcanic system that had created their prosperity. The thermal springs that bubbled from the earth in various locations around the bay were appreciated for their therapeutic properties, rather than recognized as surface expressions of the underground heat that made the entire region a single, integrated volcanic system. Wealthy Romans built elaborate bath complexes around these hot springs, considering them gifts from the gods rather than indicators of magma chambers that lay relatively close to the surface beneath their feet. This separation between cause and effect, between the geological processes that had created their world and the daily experience of living in that world, represented perhaps the most fundamental vulnerability of Herculaneum's otherwise sophisticated society. They had learned to live beautifully and intelligently within their environment, but they had not developed an understanding of that environment as a dynamic system whose apparent stability might not be permanent. The mountain that had given them everything they valued most about their lives remained capable of transforming their world as completely as it had created it. But this possibility existed outside the realm of their immediate concerns and practical planning. The morning of August 24th in the year 79 after Christ began like countless others in the long history of Herculaneum, with families stirring to the gentle rhythm of daily routine, bakers lighting their ovens for the day's bread, and fishermen preparing their nets for another expedition into the familiar waters of the bay. The mountain that had watched over their community for so many centuries stood peaceful against the summer sky, its slopes green with the vineyards and gardens that had always defined the prosperity of this coastal paradise. Nothing in the early hours suggested that this would be the last morning their world would ever know. But beneath the familiar surface of daily life, forces that had been building for decades were approaching a moment of inevitable release. Deep within the mountain's hidden chambers, pressures that had accumulated slowly and silently were reaching levels that the earth could no longer contain. The same volcanic system that had created the fertile soil and building stone upon which Herculaneum's prosperity depended was preparing to reclaim what it had given, transforming beneficence into overwhelming power in ways that no human science of that time could predict or prevent. The first signs of change were subtle enough that they might have been dismissed as minor curiosities by people whose attention was focused on the immediate concerns of their daily lives. Small tremors, barely perceptible, ran through the ground beneath the town. Animals, more sensitive to these geological stirrings than their human companions, began to display the restless behaviour that often precedes natural disasters. Dogs whined and paced without apparent cause. Horses stamped nervously in their stables. Birds took flight in unusual patterns that disrupted the normal sounds of morning. By midday, the mountain had begun to announce its intentions more clearly. A column of ash and gas began rising from Vesuvius's summit, at first appearing as nothing more than an unusual cloud formation, but gradually growing in height and density until it dominated the entire sky above the bay. This towering pillar of volcanic material climbed to heights that defied easy comprehension, reaching into the upper atmosphere where winds caught and spread its contents across vast distances. For the people of Herculaneum, watching from their terraces and streets as this extraordinary phenomenon unfolded, the initial response was likely more wonder than terror. They were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience, a display of natural power that was both beautiful and alarming. The column rose with stately majesty, its edges caught by sunlight that created colours and patterns unlike anything in normal weather. But as the hours passed and the column continued to grow, wonder gave way to a more practical concern about what this unusual event might mean for their community. The volcanic column that now towered above them was not simply a spectacular display, but a geological process of extraordinary violence and complexity. Deep within the mountain, superheated rock had been transformed into gas and ash that shot upward with tremendous velocity, carrying with it fragments of the mountain itself and creating temperatures that approached the limits of what matter could endure while remaining distinct. This material, ejected high into the atmosphere, would eventually fall back to Earth, but not in the gentle, predictable patterns of normal precipitation. As afternoon moved toward evening, the character of the eruption began to change in ways that transformed spectacle into mortal danger. The towering column of volcanic material, which had maintained its vertical ascent throughout the day, began to collapse under its own enormous weight. The upper portions of the column, no longer supported by the continuous upward thrust of new material, started to fall back toward Earth, creating cascading flows of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments that moved with frightening speed down the mountain slopes. These pyroclastic flows, as modern science would later name them, moved like avalanches of fire, carrying temperatures that exceeded the melting point of bronze and travelling at speeds that made escape impossible for anything in their path. Unlike the ashfall that buried other communities around the bay in layers that accumulated gradually over hours, these flows moved as coherent masses of superheated material that engulfed everything they encountered in moments. When the first of these flows reached Herculaneum, it transformed the town not through gradual burial but through instantaneous engulfment. The superheated gases carbonized organic materials in seconds, turning wood to charcoal while preserving its original form, transforming bread to carbon while maintaining the baker's stamp, converting living trees to mineral replicas of their former selves. The tremendous heat drove all moisture from materials that would normally decay, creating conditions for preservation that were unlike anything that occurs in normal geological processes. The flow that buried Herculaneum was not simply hot ash falling from the sky, but a moving wall of volcanic material that filled streets, entered buildings, and rose to heights that completely engulfed even the tallest structures. This material, a mixture of gas, ash, and rock fragments, behaved like a fluid while it remained hot and mobile, flowing around obstacles and into every space, but then solidified as it cooled into a solid mass of tufaceous rock that sealed everything it had covered in an airtight tomb. The transformation was complete and irreversible. A community that had evolved over centuries, accumulating layers of culture, prosperity, and refined living, was converted in a matter of hours into a perfectly preserved archaeological site, waiting beneath its volcanic shroud for rediscovery by future generations, who would marvel at the intimate details of daily life preserved in this most extraordinary of natural museums. The volcanic flow that engulfed Herculaneum created conditions for preservation that were unlike anything that occurs in normal circumstances, transforming a catastrophic moment into an extraordinary gift to future understanding. Unlike the ash that buried other communities in layers that accumulated gradually, allowing organic materials to decay naturally over time, the superheated pyroclastic surge that sealed Herculaneum created an immediate airtight environment that stopped all biological processes in their tracks, while simultaneously carbonizing organic materials in ways that preserved their original forms with startling precision. Within this sealed world, wooden beams that should have crumbled into dust centuries ago maintain their structural integrity as carbonized replicas of their former selves. You can still see the axe marks where ancient carpenters shaped them, the drill holes where joints were assembled, the wear patterns where daily use left its subtle signature. These beams continue to support roofs and floors nearly 2 millennia after the trees from which they were cut first felt the forester's saw, their carbon forms holding the exact dimensions and details that the original craftsman intended. The preservation extends to materials so fragile that they survive nowhere else from the ancient world. Papyrus scrolls, those most delicate repositories of human thought, remain on library shelves where scholars left them, their surfaces carbonized but still readable to those with the patience and skill to unfurl them carefully. These scrolls contain works of philosophy and literature that would otherwise be known only through later quotations and references, offering direct access to intellectual traditions that shaped the ancient world but had been lost to subsequent ages. Textiles, normally among the first materials to vanish from archaeological sites, present themselves here in forms that allow us to understand not just how people dressed, but how they experienced the sensory world of fabric against skin. The carbonized remains of clothing still show the weave patterns of the original cloth, the careful hemming that indicates skilled needlework, the patches and repairs that speak of families who maintained their possessions with care and attention. These textile fragments carry within their preserved fibers the intimate story of how people chose to present themselves to the world, how they balanced practical necessity with personal preference in selecting the materials that would touch their bodies each day. Food, perhaps the most ephemeral of human necessities, appears here in forms that mock the normal passage of time. Loaves of bread retain not only their shape, but the specific marks that identified individual bakers, the score patterns that controlled their rising, the subtle variations in texture that speak to differences in technique and local preference. Nuts and grains preserved in their storage containers maintain their original forms while revealing the agricultural choices that sustained daily life. Even prepared meals, caught in the moment of consumption, remain on their serving dishes like interrupted conversations between past and present. The furniture that fills these preserved spaces creates an almost uncanny sense of immediate presence, as if the families who arranged these rooms have only momentarily stepped away. Beds maintain their precise dimensions, calculated for human comfort according to standards that remain recognizable across the centuries. Tables still bear the marks of daily use, their surfaces worn smooth by countless meals and conversations. Chairs retain the angles and proportions that provided support for human bodies that experience the same basic needs for rest and comfort that define our own relationship with the physical world. But perhaps most remarkable of all is how this preservation captures not just individual objects, but entire environmental systems in perfect relationship to each other. Rooms remain intact with their contents undisturbed, showing exactly how families organized their living spaces, what they chose to keep close at hand, how they balance privacy with social interaction. Workshops maintain their original layouts, with tools arranged according to the logical patterns that made daily work efficient and pleasant. Kitchens preserve the spatial relationships between cooking areas, storage zones, and food preparation surfaces that reveal the choreography of domestic life in ways that no written description could capture. The volcanic flow that created these conditions was not a gentle process of gradual burial, but a violent transformation that occurred within minutes or hours. Yet the very violence of this change created the anaerobic conditions necessary for preservation, driving out the oxygen and moisture that would normally promote decay, while simultaneously carbonizing organic materials in ways that fixed their forms permanently. The superheated gases that brought instant death also brought a kind of immortality, stopping time in ways that allow us to step directly into the intimate spaces of ancient daily life. Moving through these preserved environments, you encounter something unique in human experience. Complete domestic worlds frozen at specific moments in their daily cycles, offering access to the private rhythms and personal choices that shaped individual lives within the larger currents of historical change. This is not the public face of ancient civilization preserved in monuments and official inscriptions, but the intimate reality of how people actually lived when they thought no one was watching, when they made the countless small decisions that, accumulated over lifetimes, created the texture of human experience in a vanished world. For generations after Vesuvius sealed Herculaneum beneath its volcanic shroud, the prevailing assumption among those who studied the buried city was that its residents had been more fortunate than their neighbours in other communities around the bay. Early excavations, conducted with the limited techniques and understanding of the 18th and 19th centuries, uncovered remarkably preserved buildings, extraordinary artefacts, and intimate details of daily life, but they found relatively few human remains. This absence seemed to tell a hopeful story, that the people of Herculaneum had received sufficient warning of the approaching disaster to organize an orderly evacuation, that they had possessed the means and time necessary to escape to safety before the volcanic flows transformed their world into a perfectly preserved archaeological site. This interpretation carried within it a comforting notion that human intelligence and social organization could, under the right circumstances, triumph over natural disaster. The evidence seemed to support a narrative in which the residents of Herculaneum, observing the initial stages of the eruption throughout the morning and early afternoon of August 24th, had made the rational decision to abandon their property and seek safety in more distant locations. The lack of human remains in the residential areas suggested that families had gathered their most precious possessions, secured their homes as best they could, and departed in time to avoid the pyroclastic flows that would soon make escape impossible. But archaeological understanding, like all knowledge, evolves through the patient accumulation of evidence and the willingness to revise conclusions when new discoveries challenge existing assumptions. In the 1980s, excavations along what had once been Herculaneum's ancient shoreline revealed evidence that transformed our understanding of what had actually occurred during those final hours when the mountain's fury descended upon the town. Here, in structures that appeared to have been boat sheds or warehouses used for storing maritime equipment, archaeologists uncovered the skeletal remains of more than 120 individuals who had sought shelter in these spaces closest to the sea. The location of these remains tells a story quite different from the orderly evacuation that earlier scholars had imagined. These people had not simply fled their homes and disappeared into the safety of distant locations. Instead, they had moved toward the sea, gathering in structures that offered some protection from the initial stages of the volcanic event while positioning themselves for what was likely their best hope of escape: rescue by boat from the waters that had always connected Herculaneum to the broader world of Mediterranean commerce and culture. Picture these final hours from the perspective of families who found themselves facing an unprecedented crisis, with limited options and no way to predict how the disaster would unfold. The volcanic column rising from Vesuvius had been visible throughout the day, but the immediate threat to Herculaneum came not from falling ash, but from the pyroclastic flows that would descend the mountain's slopes with terrifying speed. For those who understood the geography of their coastline, the logical response was to move toward the sea, where boats might provide the means of escape that overland routes could not offer. The boat sheds where these people took refuge were substantial stone structures designed to protect valuable maritime equipment from weather and theft. They would have seemed like reasonable places to wait while watching for vessels that might carry them to safety across waters that remained navigable, even as the land became increasingly dangerous. These were not random choices made in panic, but rational decisions based on the best information available to people facing circumstances that lay entirely outside their previous experience. The physical evidence preserved in these seaside shelters reveals both the demographics of those who sought refuge there and the final moments of their lives. The skeletal remains include men, women, and children from across the social spectrum of Herculaneum's population. Wealthy individuals, identifiable by jewellery and other personal possessions, sheltered alongside people of more modest circumstances, suggesting that in the face of natural disaster, the normal social hierarchies that structured daily life had given way to the more fundamental concern of survival. Some had brought with them the portable valuables that represented their most important possessions, coins, jewellery, and small objects of personal or economic significance. These choices reveal the terrible calculations that people made in moments of crisis, deciding what could be carried and what must be abandoned, what represented essential resources for rebuilding life elsewhere, and what, however precious, had to be left behind in the hope that survival would make eventual recovery possible. But the pyroclastic flows that had been approaching throughout the day moved with speeds and carried temperatures that made escape impossible once they reached the coastal areas. The superheated gases that preceded the main flow would have been lethal within moments, and the massive surge of volcanic material that followed sealed these refuges completely. Death came not gradually, through slow suffocation or starvation, but instantly, through exposure to temperatures and toxic gases that ended consciousness before fear could fully develop into suffering. The silence that followed was absolute and enduring. The voices that had filled Herculaneum's streets with the comfortable sounds of daily conversation, the laughter of children playing in courtyards, the calls of merchants advertising their wares, the gentle murmur of family gatherings around evening meals, all of this human music was stilled forever, replaced by the profound quiet of a world sealed away from time and change. This silence that enveloped Herculaneum after the volcanic flows cooled and hardened was not merely the absence of human voices, but a profound geological quiet that would persist for more than 16 centuries. Above the buried town, new landscapes gradually took shape as weather and vegetation transformed the barren volcanic deposits into fertile ground that invited resettlement. Trees took root in the volcanic soil, their branches eventually shading paths that wandered unknowingly over the roofs of buried villas. Farmers ploughed fields where Roman gardens had once bloomed, entirely unaware that their oxen walked above mosaics and frescoes that waited in perfect preservation just a few meters beneath their feet. The rediscovery of this lost world began, as many great archaeological discoveries do, through the most mundane of practical necessities. In the year 1709, a local farmer digging a well on his property struck something unexpected beneath the usual layers of soil and volcanic debris. His shovel, instead of penetrating deeper into earth, rang against marble, the polished surface of what would later be identified as part of the stage of Herculaneum's ancient theatre. This accidental encounter between agricultural necessity and archaeological treasure marked the beginning of a process that would gradually reveal one of history's most remarkable preservation sites. Word of the discovery reached Prince d'Elbeuf, an Austrian nobleman who possessed both the resources and the enthusiasm necessary to investigate what lay beneath this unremarkable farmland. His initial excavations, conducted through a network of tunnels rather than the systematic surface clearing that would characterize later archaeological work, revealed enough extraordinary artifacts to confirm that something unprecedented awaited discovery. Marble statues of exquisite workmanship, bronze vessels of unusual quality, and inscriptions that spoke of a prosperous Roman community convinced him that this site deserved serious attention and significant investment. The systematic excavation of Herculaneum began in earnest in 1738, under the sponsorship of King Charles III of Naples, whose enthusiasm for antiquarian research was matched by his desire to enhance his kingdom's prestige through association with classical civilization. These early excavations, conducted under the direction of engineers rather than archaeologists, for archaeology as a scientific discipline had not yet been invented, proceeded through tunnels and shafts that allowed access to specific buildings and areas without requiring the removal of the entire overburden of volcanic material that sealed the ancient city. The tunnel system that developed over the following decades created a strange underground world where 18th century investigators moved through Roman streets by candlelight, extracting artifacts and recording discoveries in conditions that must have felt more like tomb robbing than scientific research. These subterranean explorations revealed the Villa of the Papyri with its extraordinary library and art collection, uncovered residential areas that preserved domestic life in unprecedented detail, and gradually established Herculaneum's reputation as a site of unparalleled archaeological significance. But the very conditions that made Herculaneum's preservation so remarkable also made its excavation extraordinarily challenging. The pyroclastic flow that had sealed the city had hardened into a rock-like material that was 15 to 18 meters thick in most areas, creating a burden of solidified volcanic debris that was both difficult to remove and dangerous to work beneath. The tunnel excavations, while they allowed access to specific areas of particular interest, also created structural instabilities that limited how extensively the site could be safely explored. The transition from tunnel exploration to systematic surface excavation required technological advances and theoretical approaches that were not available to 18th century investigators. It was not until the 20th century that archaeologists possessed both the equipment necessary to remove such massive quantities of volcanic debris and the conceptual framework required to understand sites like Herculaneum as complete urban environments, rather than simply collections of valuable artifacts waiting to be extracted. Even with modern techniques and resources, the excavation of Herculaneum has proceeded slowly and selectively. The volcanic material that preserves the city so perfectly also makes access enormously expensive and technically challenging. Each area that archaeologists choose to excavate requires the removal of thousands of tons of hardened volcanic debris, the construction of elaborate support systems to ensure the safety of both excavators and excavated structures, and the immediate implementation of conservation measures to protect exposed materials from deterioration. Perhaps most significantly, the modern town of Herculano has grown up directly over much of the ancient city, creating a situation where archaeological investigation conflicts with contemporary residential and commercial development. Houses, shops, and apartment buildings now occupy spaces that almost certainly contain extraordinary archaeological remains, but the cost and complexity of relocating modern communities make comprehensive excavation practically impossible. The result is a peculiar form of layered urbanism, where ancient and contemporary life exist in close proximity, but separated by meters of volcanic rock and centuries of accumulated history. The portions of Herculaneum that remain visible to modern visitors represent only a small fraction of what archaeological investigation has revealed, and an even smaller fraction of what the complete ancient city must have contained. Entire neighborhoods, public buildings, commercial areas, and residential districts remain sealed beneath their volcanic shroud, waiting for future generations who may possess resources and techniques that current archaeology cannot imagine. The library of the Villa of the Papyri, for instance, has yielded extraordinary treasures, but scholars estimate that the majority of its collection remains unexcavated, buried beneath deposits that cannot yet be safely or economically removed. This tension between discovery and concealment, between the remarkable preservation that makes Herculaneum unique and the practical limitations that restrict access to its treasures, creates a poignant reminder of how much of human history remains hidden beneath the surfaces of our contemporary world, waiting for the combination of accident, resources, and determination that might bring it back to light. The archaeological treasures that emerged from Herculaneum's volcanic tomb over the centuries of excavation tell a story of human achievement and daily life that surpasses in intimacy and completeness anything previously known from the ancient world. Each discovery, whether a magnificent marble statue or a simple wooden spoon, contributes to an unprecedented portrait of how people actually lived, worked, and thought in a prosperous Roman community at the height of the empire's cultural sophistication. The Villa of the Papyri yielded perhaps the most extraordinary single collection of art and literature ever recovered from antiquity. Imagine walking through its gardens and reception rooms as archaeologists first encountered them, where bronze and marble sculptures stood exactly as their original owners had positioned them, creating artistic dialogues between different periods, styles, and traditions. Here, Greek masterpieces of the classical period shared space with Roman copies and contemporary works, arranged according to aesthetic principles that reflected the refined taste of collectors who possessed both unlimited resources and sophisticated understanding of artistic excellence. The bronze sculptures from this villa represent the largest collection of ancient bronzes ever found in a single location, their surfaces still bearing the lustrous patina that centuries of burial had actually enhanced rather than damaged. Portrait heads of Greek philosophers gaze with serene intelligence across rooms where Roman statesmen are immortalized in marble of crystalline purity. The arrangement of these works was clearly deliberate, creating environments where intellectual and political achievement were celebrated together, where the wisdom of the past informed the aspirations of the present. But perhaps even more remarkable than the individual pieces is what their preservation tells us about the comprehensive vision that guided their collection and display. These were not random accumulations of valuable objects, but carefully curated environments where art served to create spaces conducive to serious thought and elevated conversation. The villa's owner had invested enormous resources not simply in acquiring beautiful things, but in creating a complete aesthetic environment that would inspire and sustain the intellectual life he valued above all other pursuits. The library that gave the villa its modern name contained treasures that transform our understanding of ancient intellectual life. The papyrus scrolls, carbonized but still readable, include works by Epicurus and his followers that would otherwise be completely lost to us. Reading these texts, painstakingly unrolled and deciphered by scholars working with techniques developed specifically for this unique preservation situation, provides direct access to philosophical traditions that shaped the ancient world but survived nowhere else in such complete form. These scrolls reveal not just the content of ancient thought, but the material culture of intellectual life itself. You can see exactly how ancient books were prepared, how texts were arranged on the papyrus, how corrections and annotations were made by readers who engaged seriously with complex ideas. The library was not simply a repository of texts, but a working collection used by people who considered reading and discussion essential to a life well lived. The domestic objects recovered from Herculaneum's houses create an intimate portrait of daily life that complements the grand cultural achievements preserved in the great villas. Wooden furniture, maintained in perfect condition by the same volcanic processes that preserved the architecture, shows us exactly how Roman families arranged their living spaces. Tables still bear the marks of daily use, their surfaces worn smooth by countless meals and conversations. Beds retain their original dimensions, calculated for human comfort, according to standards that remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. The preservation of textiles, virtually unknown elsewhere in the Roman world, provides insights into how people dressed and decorated their homes that no other source could offer. Carbonized clothing still shows the careful needlework that indicates skilled craftsmanship, the repairs that speak of families who maintain their possessions with care and attention, the style choices that reflect personal taste within the broader conventions of Roman fashion. These fabric fragments carry within their preserved fibers the story of how people chose to present themselves to the world, how they balanced practical necessity with aesthetic preference in selecting the materials that would touch their bodies each day. The food remains discovered throughout the excavated areas revealed dietary habits that were both more varied and more sophisticated than literary sources had suggested. Carbonized bread still bears the stamps that identified individual bakers, showing us the commercial networks that supplied even basic necessities. Preserved nuts, grains, and prepared foods demonstrate the agricultural abundance that supported this coastal community while revealing specific preferences and preparation techniques that made meals occasions for pleasure as well as sustenance. Perhaps most moving of all are the personal objects that speak to individual lives and private concerns. Jewellery, cosmetics, children's toys, gaming pieces, writing materials, all the small items that people used in their daily routines, each carrying the invisible presence of hands that held them, minds that valued them, lives that were shaped by their use. These objects, preserved in arrangements that often suggest they were abandoned suddenly when their owners fled toward the harbour, create an almost uncanny sense of human presence that transcends the centuries that separate us from their original users. The frescoes and mosaics that decorated both public and private spaces reveal artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication. But they also show us how art was integrated into daily life, rather than set apart as something separate from ordinary experience. Every room was designed as a complete aesthetic environment where colour, pattern, and imagery combined to create spaces that please the eye while serving practical functions. This integration of beauty with utility represents an approach to human habitation that few cultures have equalled and fewer still have sustained over extended periods. The remarkable discoveries that have emerged from Herculaneum over the centuries of excavation represent only a fraction of what lies beneath the hardened volcanic deposits that still seal the greater portion of this ancient community from view. The visible archaeological site, extraordinary as it is, offers merely a glimpse into a much larger world that continues to rest in darkness, waiting beneath the feet of modern residents who live their daily lives above one of the most complete ancient cities ever preserved. This hidden Herculaneum extends in all directions beyond the current excavations, containing entire neighbourhoods, public buildings, commercial districts, and private homes that remain as perfectly preserved as those already revealed, but inaccessible due to the practical limitations that govern even the most ambitious archaeological projects. The enormity of what remains hidden becomes apparent when you consider that the excavated portions of Herculaneum represent perhaps 20% of the original ancient city. Beneath the modern town of Herculano, beneath its streets and apartment buildings, beneath its schools and shops lie Roman houses with their furniture still in place, workshops with their tools still arranged for daily use, temples with their religious artifacts still positioned for worship, libraries with their scrolls still waiting on their shelves. The volcanic flows that destroyed this community also created the most comprehensive time capsule in human history. But the very completeness of this preservation makes its revelation an undertaking of staggering complexity and cost. The early excavations, conducted with the techniques and priorities of the 18th and 19th centuries, extracted extraordinary treasures, but also inflicted damage that modern conservation science deeply regrets. Working by candlelight through narrow tunnels, investigators focused primarily on objects that could be removed and displayed, rather than on preserving the context that would have revealed how these objects functioned within the complete systems of ancient life. Frescoes were cut from walls and removed to museums, disrupting the visual relationships that made them meaningful. Sculptures were extracted without adequate documentation of their original positions and associations. Organic materials, exposed to air and light for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, began deteriorating immediately, and early excavators lacked both the knowledge and the techniques necessary to prevent this decay. The paradox that haunts all archaeological work at Herculaneum is that the very act of excavation, which brings these treasures back into human awareness, also exposes them to the destructive forces from which burial had protected them. Wood that had survived perfectly for nearly 2,000 years in the anaerobic environment, created by volcanic sealing, begins to deteriorate within months of exposure to atmospheric conditions. Frescoes that retained their original brilliance in the stable underground environment fade and flake when subjected to fluctuations in temperature and humidity. Textiles that preserved their weave patterns and even traces of their original colours crumble at the touch once the chemical processes of decay resume. Modern archaeological techniques have developed sophisticated methods for addressing these conservation challenges, but each solution brings its own limitations and costs. Climate-controlled environments can preserve exposed materials, but they require constant maintenance and significant financial resources. Chemical treatments can stabilize organic materials, but they also alter the objects in ways that may affect future research possibilities. Protective covering can shield sites from weather damage, but it also transforms the experience of encounter with these ancient spaces, creating barriers between present visitors and past inhabitants. The question of what to excavate and what to leave buried has become one of the most complex ethical and practical issues facing those responsible for Herculaneum's future. Every decision to expose a new area commits future generations to the expensive and technically demanding work of conservation, while every decision to leave areas unexplored means that irreplaceable information about human history remains inaccessible. The resources required for proper excavation and conservation are enormous, and they must compete with other pressing needs in societies that face immediate challenges of education, healthcare, and economic development. Perhaps even more challenging than the technical and financial obstacles is the reality that much of ancient Herculaneum now lies beneath a modern community whose residents have their own legitimate claims to the land and their own needs for housing, commerce, and civic life. The idea of relocating entire neighbourhoods to permit archaeological excavation raises profound questions about whose interests should take priority: those of contemporary families who need places to live and work, or those of future scholars who might learn from what lies buried beneath their homes. The villa of the Pompeii presents a particularly poignant example of these dilemmas. The portions of the villa that have been excavated have yielded extraordinary treasures, but ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques suggest that the majority of the structure, including additional wings of the library, remains sealed beneath deposits that cannot be safely or economically removed using current technology. The scrolls that have been recovered and deciphered represent perhaps 1/10 of what the complete library once contained, meaning that works of philosophy and literature that could transform our understanding of ancient thought continue to rest in darkness, perfectly preserved, but entirely inaccessible. The silence that surrounds these hidden treasures is profound and haunting. Streets where Roman families walked each morning to begin their daily routines remain empty and dark. Gardens where children played among flowering plants are sealed beneath rock harder than concrete. Workshops where craftsmen perfected techniques that modern artisans still struggle to equal weight in perfect stillness for discoveries that may never come. Libraries containing the thoughts of minds that grappled with questions we continue to find compelling rest in eternal quietude. This hidden Herculaneum exists in a state of perfect suspension between destruction and preservation, between loss and discovery, between past and future. It represents both the ultimate archaeological prize and the ultimate archaeological frustration, the most complete record of ancient life ever created, and yet one that remains tantalizingly beyond our reach, protected by the same forces that preserved it from the gradual decay that has claimed every other ancient city. Today, if you walk through the streets of the modern town of Herculaneum, you move unknowingly through one of the most extraordinary examples of layered urbanism in the world, where contemporary life unfolds directly above the perfectly preserved remains of an ancient Roman community. Children play in schoolyards where Roman gardens once bloomed 15 metres below their feet. Families gather for dinner in apartments whose foundations rest upon the roofs of houses where other families shared meals nearly 2,000 years ago. Shop owners conduct their daily business above workshops, where Roman craftsmen once practiced trades that modern artisans still struggle to equal. This vertical coexistence of past and present creates a peculiar form of urban archaeology, where the living city and the buried city exist in intimate proximity, but remain almost completely separate from each other. The residents of modern Herculaneum go about their daily routines largely unaware of the extraordinary preservation that lies beneath their homes, while tourists from around the world come to visit the small portion of ancient Herculaneum that has been made accessible through centuries of painstaking excavation and conservation work. The archaeological site that visitors encounter today represents perhaps 1/5 of the original Roman town, a carefully preserved fragment that offers extraordinary insights into ancient life, while serving as a constant reminder of how much more remains hidden beneath the contemporary urban landscape. Walking through the excavated streets, you experience the strange sensation of moving through an ancient neighbourhood that simply stops at arbitrary boundaries, determined not by Roman urban planning, but by the practical limitations of modern excavation. Streets that once connected throughout the community now end abruptly where modern construction makes further exploration impossible. The designation of Herculaneum as part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with Pompeii and other archaeological areas around Mount Vesuvius, recognises both the extraordinary significance of these preserved communities and the complex challenges involved in maintaining them for future generations. This international recognition brings resources and attention that are essential for ongoing conservation work, but it also creates obligations and expectations that strain the capacity of local authorities and archaeological institutions to provide adequate protection for materials that are both priceless and extremely fragile. The daily reality of managing this heritage site involves constant negotiation between competing demands and limited resources. The wooden structures, textiles, and organic materials that make Herculaneum unique in the archaeological world require environmental conditions that are expensive to maintain and technically demanding to provide. Fluctuations in temperature and humidity can cause immediate and irreversible damage to artifacts that survived perfectly for nearly 2 millennia in their sealed underground environment. The frescoes that retain their original brilliance when first exposed begin to fade within months, if not properly protected from atmospheric conditions that differ dramatically from the stable underground environment that preserved them. Tourism, essential for generating the revenue needed to support conservation work, brings its own challenges to the preservation of this fragile site. Thousands of visitors walking through ancient streets create vibrations that can damage delicate structures. The breath and body heat of crowds can alter atmospheric conditions in ways that accelerate the deterioration of organic materials. The simple human desire to touch and connect with these remarkable remains conflicts with the conservation necessity of preventing any direct contact that might cause damage. The relationship between the modern town of Herculaneum and its ancient predecessor creates social and economic tensions that have no easy resolution. Property owners whose homes and businesses sit above archaeological treasures face complex legal and practical constraints on how they can use their land. Development projects that might benefit the contemporary community must be weighed against the potential impact on archaeological resources that belong not just to local residents but to humanity as a whole. The economic benefits that tourism brings to the region must be balanced against the costs of the infrastructure and services required to manage visitors responsibly. Perhaps most poignantly, the residents of modern Herculaneum live with the constant awareness that their community exists above one of the most complete records of ancient life ever preserved, but that the practical realities of contemporary existence make it impossible to reveal this buried treasure in its entirety. Every new construction project raises the possibility of discovering additional areas of extraordinary preservation, but also the certainty that proper excavation and conservation would require resources and time that far exceed what any community could reasonably provide. The tension between preservation and accessibility creates philosophical questions that extend far beyond the specific challenges of managing this particular site. Should archaeological treasures be revealed even when doing so exposes them to inevitable deterioration? How do we balance the rights of contemporary communities to normal urban development against the claims of future generations to access their cultural heritage? What obligations do we have to preserve the material traces of past civilizations, and what sacrifices are we willing to make to honour those obligations? Standing in the excavated portion of Herculaneum, surrounded by the evidence of a vanished world that was interrupted in the middle of an ordinary day nearly 2,000 years ago, you become acutely aware of the fragility of all human achievement and the preciousness of the traces that survive to connect us with lives lived in circumstances very different from our own, but animated by hopes, fears, and daily concerns that remain remarkably familiar across the centuries. In the end, as we reach the close of our long journey through the buried streets and silent rooms of Herculaneum, we are left with lessons that reach far beyond the specific circumstances of one Roman town's extraordinary preservation. The story of this community, its rise from a simple coastal settlement to a sophisticated retreat for the Roman elite, its sudden transformation from living city to perfectly preserved archaeological site, and its gradual rediscovery by generations who marvelled at what accident and catastrophe had saved from the normal processes of decay, speaks to truths about human existence that transcend any particular time or place. Perhaps the most profound lesson that emerges from Herculaneum's preserved silence is how little separates the permanent from the temporary, how quickly the most stable and prosperous circumstances can be transformed by forces entirely beyond human control or prediction. The families who woke on the morning of August 24th in the year 79 had every reason to expect that their carefully constructed lives would continue indefinitely. Their houses were solid, their community was prosperous, their connections to the broader Roman world provided both security and opportunity. The mountain that watched over them had been a benevolent presence throughout their lifetimes and the lifetimes of their ancestors, providing fertile soil and building stone rather than danger. Yet within hours, this entire world was sealed away forever, transformed from a living community into a time capsule that would wait in darkness for 17 centuries before human eyes would see it again. The transformation was complete and irreversible, accomplished not through gradual decline or human conflict, but through the sudden assertion of natural forces that acknowledge no human authority or achievement. In this, Herculaneum reminds us that all our civilizations, however sophisticated and seemingly permanent, exist within natural systems whose power and unpredictability far exceed anything human intelligence can master or control. But if Herculaneum teaches us about impermanence and vulnerability, it also reveals something inspiring about the traces that human beings leave behind them. The objects that survived the volcanic flows were not the grand public monuments that the residents of Herculaneum might have expected to preserve their memory for posterity. Instead, the mountain selected for preservation the most intimate and ordinary aspects of their daily lives: the bread they baked each morning, the furniture they arranged for comfort, the tools they used in their daily work, the toys their children held close. This selection was entirely accidental, determined by the chemical and physical properties of different materials rather than by any human judgment about what was most important or valuable. Yet the result provides us with insights into ancient life that no collection of official inscriptions or public monuments could offer. We know how these people arranged their private spaces, what they ate for breakfast, how they decorated their homes, what books they read in quiet hours. We can trace the wear patterns left by their daily routines, see the repairs they made to extend the lives of valued possessions, feel the presence of their hands in the smooth depression worn into a door handle by countless openings and closings. In this accidental preservation of the ordinary, we find a kind of democratic immortality that has nothing to do with wealth, power, or public achievement. The carbonized loaf of bread speaks as eloquently about human existence as any marble statue. The wooden toy abandoned by a child carries as much historical significance as any imperial decree. The humble workshop tools reveal as much about human ingenuity and daily satisfaction as any philosophical treatise. Herculaneum preserved not the public face that its residents chose to present to history, but the private reality of how they actually lived when they thought no one was watching. This preservation of the ordinary reminds us that our own daily lives, however modest they may seem, participate in the great human story in ways that we can rarely appreciate while we are living them. The objects we handle each day, the routines we follow, the spaces we arrange for our comfort, all of these carry significance that extends far beyond their immediate practical function. They represent our small but important contributions to the ongoing human experiment of creating meaning, beauty, and satisfaction within the constraints that natural and social circumstances place upon us. Herculaneum also teaches us about the value of memory and the importance of preserving traces of vanished ways of life, not because they were perfect or should be replicated, but because they expand our understanding of human possibility and remind us of paths not taken, approaches to living that our own circumstances have made difficult or impossible to imagine. The sophisticated integration of public and private life, the careful attention to beauty in everyday objects, the balance between individual comfort and community responsibility that characterize this ancient community, these represent solutions to enduring human challenges that remain relevant even when the specific conditions that created them have vanished forever. As we consider our own relationship to the environments that sustain us, Herculaneum's story encourages a kind of thoughtful humility about the stability of the systems upon which our comfort and security depend. Climate, geology, politics, economics, all of the foundations of civilized life remain subject to changes that can occur more rapidly and completely than our normal experience prepares us to understand. Yet this awareness of vulnerability need not lead to anxiety or despair. Instead, it can deepen our appreciation for the gifts we have received and our responsibility to use them wisely while they remain available to us. In the gentle sadness that accompanies any encounter with Herculaneum's preserved silence, we find not just mourning for what has been lost, but gratitude for what accident has saved. These fragments of ordinary life, rescued from the normal processes of decay and forgetting, provide us with something precious. The knowledge that human beings living in very different circumstances from our own face the same fundamental challenges of creating meaning, comfort, and beauty in their daily lives, and that they often succeeded in ways that continue to inspire and instruct us across the vast distance of nearly 2,000 years.